This is The Speaking Show. I'm David Newman, and you're tuned in to the #1 podcast for speakers, consultants, and experts who want to speak more profitably. I am here with Matt Johnson of PursuingResults.com. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing awesome. How are you, David?
So you are a podcasting guru, and you've got a very interesting service and a very interesting value proposition for folks like us, speakers, consultants, coaches, thought-leading professionals, as we call them around here. Give us a little bit of a professional journey of what brought you to this business at this time, and what were some of the stops along the way?
Yeah. So 5 years ago, I was just some dude working in a marketing agency. And so we started doing business development. And the way that we did it was we went out and built relationships with all the key influencers, speakers, and coaches in the space that we played in and started doing live Google Hangouts. Now, I was fortunate that I had a background in doing what our clients did, which in this case was real estate. So I had read all the books. I knew who the coaches were. I knew who the players were. So I started jumping on these conversations and was able to do more than just facilitate. I was actually able to contribute, even though, we're talking about guys that are making millions of dollars in gross commissions. I had no business being on those interviews by all, intents and purposes, but it was fun. And so at one point, one of those guys pitched me and just called me up one day and said, "Hey, we should start a podcast together. I think we'd have a lot of fun. I want to sell coaching. I know you want to experiment with some stuff, selling products and programs." And so we did. And that was the entire business plan was, hey, let's do this. So that turned out to be Real Estate Uncensored, which today has over 1 million downloads and has been named one of the top 5 podcasts in that space. It's for residential agents and is still going strong. So that led to all the other good things happening, such as me getting involved with helping people start coaching and consulting companies. And the thing that I found that I was doing for them that actually had the most powerful effect was launching their podcast and getting them featured on podcasts. Right. So once I figured that out, I'm like, okay, well, I know who I want to work with. I want to work with coaches, consultants, speakers, authors. But the most important thing I can do for them out of all the marketing stuff that we tried, the thing that had the most effect was podcasting. So I narrowed down and just created a service that sells one thing to that one type of person, which kind of catches us up to where I'm at now.
Fantastic. Now, let's zoom out to maybe 10 or 15,000 feet. Podcasting has been around forever, seemingly forever, certainly forever in internet marketing terms.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk 15,000-foot overview of podcasting. A lot of people listening might think, I missed the boat on podcasting. Podcasting has been around forever. I should have started a podcast 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago. It's too late for me. Seth Godin said a couple of months ago, podcasting is the new blogging. And imagine if you had started a blog in the late 1990s or early 2000s, that's what the podcasting scene is right now as we're speaking. How does that work? Do you agree with that? Or what do you say to someone who says, I think I missed the boat?
Well, I don't think podcasting is anywhere near its peak. So what is the numbers? Is something like there's 100 million blogs? If that's not a fictitious number, it's got to be pretty close to that, I would think. And there's only 700,000 podcasts on iTunes. I mean, we're talking about a fraction of how many blogs there are. I think it's just going to get to the point, especially for speakers and consultants and coaches. One of the easiest things for us to do is to jump on and hit record, especially if you're talking about conversations with other people, like where we're talking about things that we are excited and passionate about, and we have a 10 and 20 years depth of experience in. This is really easy. I'm a writer. Like, I enjoy writing. It's still easier for me to jump on and do a podcast episode than crank out a blog article. And I think most people are like that. So for us on our side, it's easier to create content this way. The tools and the technology and the systems for turning, audio and video content into a bunch of other forms of content are getting easier and cheaper. It's now easier to create stuff out of our podcast that can be posted to social media than it is to just hop on and create something from scratch. Right. So it's easy to get a VA involved in helping us build our social audience. So there's that. And then on the audience side, look, we're about to go through a very interesting transition where most people are buying cars that have dashboards and podcast apps pre-installed. So now podcasting is going to be just as easy and accessible as radio was in the 50s. And we saw the explosion of consumption there. It drove the music industry to multi, billion, 10 billion, whatever it was. So I think that's going to happen again with podcasting. So we are nowhere near the peak. Audiences are still growing. Audiences are figuring out how to subscribe, and it's about to get even easier with things like Alexa and cars that have apps pre-installed. So yeah, I think we're just still in the middle of the growth swing.
Now, I know podcasts, there's many different formats, right? There's the solo podcast, there's the interview podcast. When you're advising your clients who want to start getting this visibility and credibility and lead generating power, what kind of podcast do you recommend that they create? And then should we be starting out in the podcasting world with hosting a podcast in the first place?
That's a great question because no, I think the place to start out was actually getting featured as a podcast guest first. So set that aside for a moment. When you do decide to launch a show, here's what I think is sustainable and proven out by my experience with actual coaches and speakers and consultants. Number one, once a week. Anything more than that, and you'll eventually burn out. Once a week is sustainable. Once a week, you can, if you go on vacation, you record a couple of episodes in advance and you're good. More importantly, the audience tends to not necessarily be able to handle more than that. Now, I've done this in a real estate context where we ran 3 episodes a week and almost bumped it up to a daily show, right? Guess what you attract? People with time on their hands. Those are not the people who turn around and buy high ticket coaching or bring you in from, a $5,000 or $10,000 speaking engagement, right? So that's why I think weekly is best. Now, in terms of the mix of the content, my recommendation, we have a certain formula that we recommend, which is 1 to 2 conversations with fellow influencers, like what we're doing here. A success story where you bring on one of your successful clients, or maybe an event organizer where you spoke for them and knocked their socks off, right? Success story. And then finally, a solo episode. So this is your chance to get up, stand, and deliver, right? Deliver your message to your audience, lead them to new beliefs and new results, right? So 10 to 15 minutes, don't make it hard on yourself, solo episode. So those are the 3 things that are like the raw ingredients that if you just mix those in, makes a really good weekly podcast formula for what I would call not just a podcast, but an actual thought leadership platform, which if you're a speaker, that's what you want. You don't just want a marketing vehicle. If you want it to generate actual leads that turn into speaking engagements, it has to be a thought leadership platform.
So let's talk about what that means. I know that it's a very popular term now about thought leader, thought leadership. What is your definition of a thought leadership podcast that's done the right way? And then what kind of podcast is discounted or seen as cheesy or overly self-promotional where it's not a thought leadership podcast?
Okay. So I'm going to give 2 very, very well-known examples, but I want to clarify in the second one that I'm not saying anything bad about what they've built. So let me start out with that. So number 1 is Seth Godin. That's the ultimate thought leadership podcast. So his podcast, Akimbo, is amazing. It's just Seth, right? Just like his blog. It sounds just like him. Now, when you go read his blog, if you've been listening to his podcast, you read his blog in his voice with all the glorious, pregnant pauses that Seth likes to throw in there. So I love that podcast. That to me is the perfect example of a thought leadership podcast. It directly ties in, and there's a very straight line between the podcast and the Akimbo workshops, the Alt MBA. The stuff is promoted. And then if you go to his website to hear the podcast, then you're getting retargeted ads on Facebook for the workshops and the Alt MBA. Perfect. Like the whole funnel is perfect, right? So if you're going to imitate somebody, imitate him. Here's who not to imitate if you're actually a speaker and you have a high ticket service, Entrepreneur on Fire. So Entrepreneur on Fire built an audience, which he's monetized, and he makes all this stuff public. So this is not news, which is 90% of his income comes not from sponsorships, but from selling other people on the dream of making $1 million a year on sponsorships, when he actually makes 6 figures a year, low 6 figures on sponsorships, and then did stuff like the Freedom Journal to monetize his large audience. That does not generate high dollar speaking gigs or high dollar coaching consulting gigs because he doesn't present himself as the expert. He's the interviewer. Interviews create demand for more interviews, not high dollar coaching, speaking engagement, stuff like that. So anyway, that's my belief system on that. So if you're going to follow somebody, follow Seth. If you're the speaker and you want to generate actual speaking engagements.
Hey, good looking. Are you currently getting paid to speak? Would you like to ramp that up? We can help. Book a confidential speaker strategy call with our team at doitmarketing.com/call, and let's see what we might do together. The call is free, but the results may be priceless. People might think, but I also know that there's a lot of tech involved in a podcast, meaning audio editing, putting in the bumpers, putting in the little commercials, uploading to iTunes, search engine optimization so you come up in the right keywords when someone searches speaking or real estate or whatever their topic is. Is this something that most people have time for? Or, I mean, let's talk about some of the fabulous things you do at Pursuing Results, where, it seems that you're the easy button. How do you partner alongside a coach or a consultant who wants to have a podcast, who has this good intention of the thought leadership DNA that you're recommending, but take all the tech work and all the monkey work off their plate?
Yeah, well, and I've been through that journey, right? So when I first launched my podcast, I did it all and then steadily built a team and handed over one excruciating task at a time. So I know the work that's involved, and yes, it can be done. I wouldn't recommend that you do it. If you have something high ticket to sell, you're much better off partnering with an agency like ours, because we'll take over all the tech stuff and allow you just to show up and have the conversations and hit record. And then you walk away and we do the rest, which includes all the email marketing, the social media promotion to promote the episodes. We notify the guest when their episode is out and give them the materials they need to promote on their side. Like, all that stuff is handled. Now, you could partner with like an indie producer, a smaller company, or you could even hire a marketing assistant. And in fact, one of the things that we'll be doing in our agency is just making that process easy, so we can help you launch a show. We'll produce it for a while, but then eventually I'd like to help people bring it in-house so that you get all the customization and control and still have quality and consistency, right? With my agency, we have a certain formula that we follow, and if you fit into that box, we'll deliver you amazing concierge level service, but not everybody fits into that box. So my vision is eventually, we're going to help 1,000 people run podcasts, but for the most part, it's going to be virtual assistants doing the production work, and we're going to lead and train them. So that to me is the future of where all this stuff is going, is we as a speaker can't do everything ourselves. Just like Dan Kennedy had his longtime assistant, right? We need to have somebody who's helping us do the business of running a speaking business, even if that's all that we do. And that person could be producing our podcast, and they could be pitching us on podcasts and getting featured all over the place if they were trained and equipped. We've taken care of the first step of that in terms of like training them on how to get people featured and pitched on podcasts. And then the next step after that is to train them on how to launch and produce shows ongoing, because that to me is the future. Everyone has a podcast, every speaker has a podcast, and it's run in-house by someone that reports to them.
Great vision. I want to ask you about niching, because I think a lot of people say, well, I have so many interests and I'm just going to start the Smart People podcast. And we're going to bring in people. It's kind of like a TED Talk concept, that we're going to have, engineers and scientists and artists and tech executives, and my personal chef is going to come on. And not that I have a chef.
No, exactly.
The idea, it's a spray and pray strategy, because they figure, well, I'm going to be like, a magazine, and I'm just going to cover all kinds of topics and all kinds of interesting people and tell their story. Why is that not a great strategy? And how do you recommend this whole niche podcast concept? Why niche? How to make that a real specialized show instead of a general interest show?
I think the best way to answer that is to start off with a question, which is, where is TED leading people? I have no idea. So the question is, if TED sold coaching or if TED sold consulting, who would sign up for it? Who knows? So they've built this great machine that gets us all to pay attention and watch the videos and listen to the podcast. And that's all great. And we show up to the events and whatever. But if they actually sold something like coaching and consulting on the back end, who would buy it? Because they have no idea what TED stands for, because TED stands for nothing. All it stands for is smart people sharing surprising things. Great. That's good for building an audience, not so good for selling anything to that audience. So that's what we want to avoid. I've seen that happen too much in the world of podcasting, where you build an audience and you focus on the audience numbers. And so you give them the content you think the audience wants, and it works. And then you spend the next 10 years twisting yourself into pretzels trying to get them to buy something. Not a fun position to be in. I know somebody that has 300,000 followers on Instagram that can't figure out how to sell them a damn thing, right? So that is a very unfun position. What does work in the world of podcasting, especially right now, and will continue to work even as podcasts grow, is to create a podcast that people in the most valuable slice of a niche are already looking for and can't find. So I'll give you an example. So one of my clients, one of my very first clients, actually, we helped him launch a podcast in a very small slice of the real estate market that's only concerned with people who run real estate teams, who want to build the teams bigger so that they can become the CEO and stop selling day to day. Right? Because my client runs a 7-figure real estate business that it takes him less than 1 day a week to run. He's got the content. He's got a clear and compelling idea, and he's selling to people that have money because they're already running real estate teams and they make high commissions, right? So there's a lot of things that they did right. So he essentially dominates that part of the space and built a very successful coaching business that has, I think, 100 group coaching clients right now. That was built in, I don't know, less than 3 years off the strength of a podcast that gets no more than a couple thousand downloads per episode. Like, compared to the Tim Ferriss numbers, it's so tiny, but it's the exact right people. And it's the people who have money and have a big, valuable problem. And he had exactly the right content to solve it. If you can follow that model, you'll be extremely successful and your podcast will take off. And then from there, if it gets, more popular beyond that, it's gravy.
Really smart advice. I think another thing that people look at is they look at some of these big podcasts, whether they're in a niche or not, but specifically the ones that are doing what they would like to do. And they say, oh my gosh, this person has like 325 ratings. They've got 80 reviews. I'm never going to catch up. Talk about the ratings, the reviews, that whole kind of external credibility that when we're starting with zero, guess what? We got 0 ratings, we got 0 reviews, and you got to start anyway. Is there some way to stimulate that? Is there some way to accelerate that? Or are those even important?
They are important, but I mean, not to iTunes at least. iTunes bases your chart success off of how many subscribers you get in a 72-hour period. They care about how many people care about this show enough to hit subscribe. So they've kind of de-emphasized reviews. Now, there's lots of people that still look at it to figure out if your show is credible. And so the more, the better, right? Talk about it, build it into the intro, outro of your show, encourage people to do it. When I first got started, my co-host on the real estate show would literally take people's iPhones if he was out at a networking event or a party and say, hey, just give me your phone. And he'd go leave us a review on behalf of that person. I mean, you can do all kind of fun stuff like that. But I will say this. I can count on less than 2 hands in 4+ years of producing and hosting podcasts how many times I've reached out to a big influencer to be on the show and have them ask me anything about the downloads or how many reviews and ratings do you have or any credibility indicator about the show. Because when I reach out to people, the focus is on the quality of the conversation that we're going to have and what I feel like they're going to be able to share on my show that they can't necessarily share on other shows. That gets immediate yeses, right? And then, of course, the audience, they don't know or really care whether there's a whole bunch of ratings and reviews. I mean, it's great social proof, and it gets to the point where it starts to snowball, and that's all well and good. But yeah, when you're first starting out, if you focus on having really good, high-quality conversations that solve a real problem for the right people, they don't care if it's not the biggest podcast in the world.
Now, you also mentioned something a few minutes ago that I want to circle back to, which is that the interview format, if you're not doing it right, that's not going to build business because you're just the host and you're not positioning yourself as the quote unquote thought leader. How do we take an interview-based show and attract inbound leads and inquiries and future clients?
So the key there, and this is a skill that's built over time, but number one, it's a reframe. So you reframe it from interview to conversations. That's why nothing about my podcast business says interview. It's dialogue or it's conversation. Right. So that sets it up in the right frame right off the bat. So when I have somebody as a guest on my show, they're not coming on to be interviewed. They're having a conversation. So they're expecting me to give my perspective. The whole conversation is filtered through the lens of my belief system. And then I'm also putting a custom introduction on the front side after I know what we talked about that relates everything that we talked about back to my belief system. Because the whole thing, like when you're podcasting as a thought leader, as a speaker, you want to convey your point of view that's positive, that's polarizing, that's magnetic to your right people. And you want to invite guests on that you can have a conversation with that allows you to convey your point of view. And so hopefully you invite people on that already agree with a good chunk of what you believe in. And then you avoid the areas artfully where you don't agree, right? Keep those kind of behind the scenes because you want your audience coming away with a belief system. You don't want your audience just coming away with tactics that they can implement. Like tactics will get them short-term results. It doesn't get you loyal followers. And ultimately, it might get you some speaking engagements, but the speaking engagements then won't turn into high dollar coaching consulting behind the scenes, which a lot of times is where the real money is made. So anyway, all that to say, like you're looking to convey your point of view. So if you frame it as a conversation and you invite people on who tend to agree with a good chunk of what you have to say, your audience is going to come away knowing your point of view and knowing where they agree with you. And the goal is to move more of them into higher levels of agreement.
Matt, you are completely wrong.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That goes counter to everything that I believe.
Exactly.
No, that's really a great point. I would love to hear a sample or kind of a template, if you will, for that 1 or 2 minute frame up at the beginning of each episode that you coach your clients to do. So I'm imagining that the way this would go is, hey, tune in. This is episode number 747. And my guest is the awesome Matt Johnson. What we talked about is boom, 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 boom. I want you to pay special attention to the way that Matt distinguishes a thought leadership podcast from just a commodity podcast, because as I always tell our clients, you have to stand out. Is it that kind of thing?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head perfectly. You take what they say, you relate it back to your beliefs, and you point out like the as I always say, or as we always tell our clients, 100%. Like you should have those, let's say 10 things, right? Those are your key core beliefs, the things that you teach your clients or the things that you hit in your speaking engagements, right? Like, and you're always looking for ways to relate what the guest is talking about to those same core 10 things, like your 10 commandments, right? Yeah, relating back to that.
And then do we also put a bumper on the end, kind of a post-game debrief, or it's enough to just put one at the beginning?
You could. I will say most people, not most. There is a percentage of people that will miss that. So make sure it's in the intro. If you do like an outro bumper that kind of sums things up, great, do it. But most of your audience is going to make sure they listen to the front side. So put all the best stuff there.
What a great episode. Wowza. Tell you what, if you want to ramp up your revenue as an expert who speaks professionally, you should really check out our free online training at doitmarketing.com/webinar. Let's talk about when people are first getting started. In addition to the tech and some of the other obstacles, what do you see as some of the mindset challenges in starting a podcast? Because some people will say, well, I'm already really busy. Some people will say, well, I'm not really great, talking to people, or, I'm not a professional interviewer. So how do we get our feet wet as a thought leading coach, consultant, etc.? Now, all of a sudden we're a radio host. Now, all of a sudden we're, 60 minutes style interviewer. How do we transfer some of these interviewing skills rapidly so that even the first 5, 10, 15 shows are not just a piece of crap?
Okay. Well, a couple things. So I guess, first of all, recognize that you are not going to be happy with the first 10 or 15 episodes regardless, right? Now, the audience probably won't be able to tell, and they'll probably go back and listen to your older episodes at some point, and they won't think anything of it. You'll look back at them and you'll think you were Quasimodo and you're, like shying away and telling people you're hideous. That's natural. So just understand that everybody goes through that. The second thing is I've done the morning radio style podcast and it's fun. Like that's the way my real estate podcast is. It's very morning radio style. It's fun, but that's not what I recommend my clients do, right? What I recommend my clients do is think of it, because I do this on my other podcast where it's more aimed at coaches and consultants. The goal is to have a behind the scenes, naturally flowing conversation that just happens to be recorded and gives the listeners an eavesdrop experience. So I think that frees you from the pressure of trying to think of yourself as a radio host or a 60-minute style interviewer. That's not even the goal. The goal is just happen to have the record button on while you're having a kind of high level, in-depth, behind the scenes discussion that most people only get when they go to conferences and they're hanging out with people at the bar in between sessions. So if you think about it that way, usually when I tell my clients that, the light bulb goes off and they're like, oh, well, yeah, I have those conversations all the time. You're telling me you just kind of hit record and then you have one of those? I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that takes care of most of that.
Yeah, no, that's really, really valuable. And at a conference, we call that the value of the hallway. Right? That's where the real nitty gritty. That's where you get the best ideas, the best strategies. Hey, what are you doing with this? And what do you think about that? And what tools are you using? And how are you approaching this problem or that problem?
Yeah, that's so true.
How are we doing on this show, by the way? This is pretty good, or is this...
Yeah. But I want to hear more about your point of view. I would want more back and forth. I want to hear what you think. I don't want you to just compliment my opinions, even though it's much appreciated. I would love more back and forth. I want to know more about what you believe in the flow of the conversation. Yeah.
So this is a really important distinction. This is almost like when you said conversation, we're almost erasing the line between host and guest. We're co-hosting this show right now. If people think of it one way, would it make sense for them to say, hey, listen, pretend that you're co-hosting a show. You have a different co-host every week, different co-host every episode, but you're exchanging views, you're sharing ideas, you're spitballing, you're brainstorming, and then people get to be a fly on the wall.
Yes, that is a great way to put it. And I love the phrase brainstorming because that does kind of put people in the frame of mind of, oh, we're going to play with some ideas. I got onto a podcast interview here a few weeks back, and it was interesting because we were talking about confidence, and I have some opinions. And I think the host felt like I was disagreeing with him. And I'm like, no, we're just hanging out, having a conversation about how do you build confidence. But he had a coaching program that had a very specific approach to building confidence. And I think I accidentally gave the impression that I disagreed with it. But you have to create the space where that's okay, where you say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, cool. Well, like I always tell my clients this, that like that's a little bit different perspective. I hadn't thought about that before. And moving on.
It's the old yes and.
Yes and. That's right.
Yes and strategy. All right. Well, Matt, this has been totally fantastic. I've got 2 final questions for you here as we're wrapping up. The final question is, how can people get connected and stay connected to you and to all the great work that you're doing at pursuingresults.com? But even before that, my second to last question is, if folks were to take one central idea away about the concept and practice of podcasting, what do you hope that one central idea would be?
Focus on relationships first. So I think one of the things that people get in trouble with, whether they host a podcast or whether they start getting featured on podcasts, is you will inevitably hit a dip where you're doing all the work, but you haven't seen all the results yet. You haven't started to get recognized at the events yet. Those speaking engagement invitations haven't started to roll in, or you're not doubling your speaking fee quite yet. All that stuff will happen in time. But what happens in the short term, if you focus on relationships, is you get quick wins, which is you get conversations like this with another high-level influencer who knows a lot of your potential clients and can open doors to things like speaking engagements or joint venture opportunities or whatever. Or you might build up a referral relationship where that person sends you clients for the next 5, 10, or 20 years. That has nothing to do with the audience of the podcast. That's only the guest. So my biggest piece of advice, whether you're getting featured, whether you host a podcast or whatever, is just focus on connecting with the right people and building real, authentic friendships with the people that you meet through podcasting, because that will give you quick wins on your way to building up an audience.
I love it. So it's really about podcasting as a relationship builder, not as a transactional machine that's just cranking out episodes for no reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Love it. All right, Matt Johnson, link us up. We're going to put these all in the show notes under this episode at thespeakingshow.com. Where can we guide people? How do they get connected and stay connected to more of your brilliance?
Yeah, so I did a whole training on how to get featured, how to find the right podcast, how to make friends with the podcast host, and how to construct the perfect story hook so that when you reach out to a podcast, hosts actually say yes, which is the important part. So that's at howtogetfeatured.com. That's the easiest place to start. If you want to keep tabs on me, I've got a book coming out in the next couple months called New Media Machine, which breaks down exactly how coaches and consultants win the battle for attention, become micro famous, and attract ideal clients systematically without being glued to your phone. So this is not another strategy for how to do 25 Instagram stories a day. That's probably the easiest ways to keep track of me. And you'll be able to find me just through New Media Machine as I rebrand everything to that. So by the time this podcast episode comes out, the book might be out, or you might just be able to find me there and on Instagram and Facebook and all those fun places through that.
Awesome. All right, Matt, thank you for a fantastic conversation. We have to have you back. We'll have you back when the book comes out. That'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'd appreciate that.
Well, that wraps up another episode of The Speaking Show. Hey, tell you what, if you like us, rate us and review us on iTunes. Subscribe. Tell a friend. Go grab the notes and downloads and extras at thespeakingshow.com. See you next time.